Hi there and welcome to this video. Today we're going to be looking at the Nikon Z50 APS-C crop sensor mirrorless camera that they brought out in 2019. In a previous video I put down some thoughts on the new D780, a different kind of DSLR as Nikon have tagged it, and this is going to be a bit similar. This is the Z50 though, and what I'm going to do is not a spec sheet comparison, but really a use case comparison. I'm going to be really looking at where does the Z50 sit versus the Z6 predominantly. And as you'll know, Nikon released the Z50 back at the in Q4 of 2019. So the tagline that Nikon have given it is "Some cameras are born to go places." So it's quite clearly targeted at a sort of travel type market where perhaps a user wants more than the functionality built into their smartphone, but wants something that's light and compact and simple to use. So as I said, I'm going to be comparing the Z50 predominantly with the Z6 just to give a comparison. And we'll have a look at what I think is the target market for the Z50. So if we start this real world comparison and looking at some of the similarities and the differences between the two cameras, obviously the Z6 is a full frame mirrorless camera, whereas the Z50 is a crop sensor, an APS-C sensor camera. And what I'm going to be doing in going through, as I say, it's not going to be a spec sheet comparison. It's going to be really looking at different aspects of real world use. So let's just talk about the Z6, and I'm going to be comparing a Z6 with the 2470 f4 lens attached to it, because there's no point in just comparing the two bodies. You have to think about real world, what are we going to be using it combined with in terms of lenses. So that package, the Z6 with 2470 f4, in the UK is retailing around about £1,750 at the moment. The Z50 by comparison, the most likely lens that people are going to be using it with is the lens that you can buy with it, the 16 to 50 f3.5 to f6.3 lens. That's the very compact travel lens, and when you put the 1.5 times multiplier on a 16 to 50, you broadly get a 24 to 70, so it is a comparable. And here in the UK, that kit is, you can get different deals, but it's somewhere between 950 and 1,050 pounds, so around about the £1,000 mark. So just a little over half the price of that Z6 kit. So let's start with the physical dimensions. If we look at those two kits, the Z6 and 2470 f4 and the Z50 and the 16 to 50 lens, if we look at the weight, then the Z6 kit comes in at around 1200 grams and the Z50 comes in at around 600 grams, so about half the weight. So you can already see that this really is tailored to a travel type user. In fact, even if you had both of the lenses that have been released with it, the 16 to 50 and the 50 to 250mm lens, which will give you a really versatile kit, the Z50 weighs in at under a kilo, so still less than the Z6 with 2470 f4 lens. And whilst I don't have a Z50 of my own, I have had a try with one, I have played around with one, and the quality that I saw with the lenses that have been released with it was actually really good. So that's the weight. If we look at the physical dimensions of the camera, as you'll remember, the D780 that I talked about in a previous video was about 1 centimetre or so bigger than the Z6 and Z7 footprint on the 3 dimensions of height, width and depth. Well, the Z6 is about 1 centimetre or so bigger than the Z50, so we're seeing a bit of a waterfall effect of size and weight between the D780, the Z6 and then the Z50 kit. And obviously if you're marrying it up with the 16 to 50 lens, which folds down like a pancake lens, you get a real benefit in terms of the size, when you're putting the Z50 into a camera bag. So how are Nikon making that weight reduction with the Z50? Well, whereas the Z6 is fully weather sealed and has a full magnesium alloy body, the Z50 only has a magnesium alloy top and front and isn't as weather sealed or isn't classified as weather sealed in the same way that the Z6 is. So a lot of the weight saving will be coming in this area. If we continue looking at the outside of the cameras, what we've seen in the past with Nikon's Pro and Enthusiast lines of cameras is that they have slightly different user interfaces. The Pro cameras like the D850 and the D5 had a system of memory banks where you could program in different settings into different memory banks, and that was quite confusing to use until you got used to it perhaps. Whereas with the more enthusiast level cameras, they had user programmable U1, U2 settings on the mode selector dial on the top, which was easier to use but perhaps had less functionality compared to the Pro line. And what we're seeing now is a much more consistent approach with regards to user interface through the Z50, the Z6 and 7, and also the D780, which is great if you're moving between cameras. That said, there are a few differences between the Z6 and the Z50 in that obviously the Z6 has a display on the top of the camera body, whereas the Z50 doesn't have that. There are some differences in where the buttons are positioned and the number of buttons. Both cameras have two programmable buttons on the front. However, the Z6 has an AF on and drive buttons on the back and a thumbstick, whereas the Z50 doesn't. And some of the buttons that are on the Z6 are built into a touch interface on the side of the LCD screen on the Z50, just to save that little bit more space as it's a bit smaller. I didn't have a problem in using those when I had a play with the camera. I wasn't using it in anger in a real scenario. I was just having a play around with it for an hour or so, and I quickly got used to the different positions of the buttons. You'll also notice that whereas on the Z6 and 7 the switch to move between still images and video is on the back of the camera around the AF on button, and the Z50 it's on the top of the body, but similar functionality, is just the position that's slightly different. If we look at the EVF and the LCD, which is the other external part of the camera that we use a lot, then what we see is a similar specification, but with the Z50 having a slightly downgraded version compared to the Z6, not unsurprisingly. So whereas on the Z6 and Z7 you've got a 1.27 centimeter, 3000, nearly 4000 dot OLED EVF, on the Z50 you've got a 0.99 centimeter, 2500 dot OLED. Still very good, I found, really easily usable, no massive lag with either of them. And on the LCD monitor, both have got a 3.2 inch TFT touch screen on the back. However, the Z6 and Z7 have a 2100 dot screen, whereas the Z50 has a 1040 K dot screen. So slightly different there. So not surprising differences there, considering that the Z50 is really aimed at this travelling enthusiast versus the Z6 and the Z7, which are really aimed at serious enthusiasts and pros. Now, if you think about the kit that each of those two types of users are going to be carrying, then the Z6 user is likely to be carrying a laptop, a full-size tripod, and therefore the kit I find weighs in at somewhere between about 7 and 10 kilos in total when I'm travelling. If you look at the likely user who's going to be using perhaps a Z50, they're perhaps going to be travelling with an iPad that they can import their photos into and process on the move. They'll be using a tripod, but their kit's going to probably weigh in somewhere between 4 and 5 kilos with the benefit of the lighter Z50 kit. So we're seeing, quite a difference in the amount of effort that people are taking with regards to the amount of kit they're carrying and how they're going to use the cameras. I would say that the average Z6, Z7 user, when they're going out, their primary purpose is to take images or video, whereas perhaps the Z50 user is traveling and it's their secondary purpose is to capture stills and video. You know, so a Z6 user will be quite happy getting wet to get their images, whereas perhaps a Z50 user will use it in more fair weather situations. So the weather sealing is really important. The weight penalty that a Z6, Z7 user is willing to take for that is going to be different. So you start to see the different markets, the different use cases that Nikon is really targeting these two cameras at. So let's now turn to some of the other hardware that's really important in real-world use of these cameras, and we'll start with the battery. Whereas in the Z6 and Z7 it uses an EN-EL15B battery, which is backward compatible to the other EN-EL15 batteries, and that comes in at about a 1900 milliamp hour capacity. The Z50 uses a different battery. It uses the EN-EL25 battery, which only has a capacity of around about 1120 milliamp hours. And so in capacity terms is quite a bit smaller than the EN-EL15. However, the official number of images that you're predicted to get from a single battery is the same or similar on both cameras. They both come in at around 300 to 400 still images. However, if you look at some of the other reviews out there, actually like the Z6 and Z7, the real world usage with the battery is considerably higher at about 1.5 hours of 4K movie and 800 to 1000 images. So for the same output in terms of number of images shot with a single battery, Nikon is getting away with a much smaller battery and therefore lighter battery, I guess, in the Z50 compared to the Z6. And of course, that should flow through to a quicker charge time for the smaller battery, but only if you're using it outside the camera. However, if you're charging in the camera, then this is where there is another difference in the two cameras, which has a slightly adverse effect on the Z50. Whereas on the Z6 and Z7, on the side of the camera we have a USB-C connection with a USB 3.0 capability. On the Z50 you actually only get a micro USB connector, which is USB 2, and this has quite a big impact when it comes to the amount of power that can be pushed through those different connections. So I think what we're seeing and what I'm hearing from talking to people is if you want to charge the Z50, the EN-EL25 battery in camera, it will take you about 3.5 hours, whereas with the Z6 it only takes about 2.5 hours for a much larger battery. So again, we're seeing a differentiation between the two cameras in terms of real-world usage. So if we continue around the camera and look at the other side, we've obviously got the memory card. Now, whereas the Z6 and Z7 you have that controversial single XQD card, and what people seem to be finding is the reliability of XQD cards is considerably better than perhaps they've experienced with the SD cards. The Z50, however, has a single SD UHS-1 level card slot. So again, we're seeing a differentiation. And where this really matters is that the XQD card has a data transfer read and write of around about 400 megabytes per second versus a UHS-1 SD card, which is at around about 104 megabytes per second write and a read of up to about 170 megabytes per second. So when the camera is writing to the card, it can obviously clear the buffer in the Z6 quicker than it probably can in the Z50. So when it comes to the type of memory card, one of the real considerations for real-world use is how quickly you can get your images from the memory card into your computer, your laptop or your iPad. So if we look at the different ways you can do this, if we're using the cable to connect to the camera, connect the camera to your PC or your computer, then with that USB 2 connection in the Z50, you're likely to be able to transfer at about 30 to 40 megabytes per second versus the USB 3 in the Z6, which is about 70 megabytes per second. So it's about half the speed. If you take the card out of the camera and you put it into a card reader, then again, with the SD card, you'll only be able to read off of it if you've got a fast SD card at a maximum of 170 megabytes per second. So a 60 gigabyte card will take about 6 minutes. Whereas with the XQD card, you can read off of them, I'm finding, at around about 340 megabytes per second, which for a 60 gigabyte card is about 3 minutes. So half the time for the XQD card versus the SD card. So it's a lot of these real world comparison, real world usage figures that can be as important as the spec sheet figures on cameras. It's how you use them and the performance you'll get in the real world rather than what's written on the spec sheet. So as I've been editing this video, I've realised that actually I've captured far too much content for a normal size video. I like to try and keep my videos to under 20 minutes because I know that's how I tend to view YouTube, and therefore I didn't want to create a video that was probably 30 or 40 minutes even long. Equally, I didn't want to condense the material I'd captured and cut out bits that were quite valuable. So what I've decided is, as I've edited it, to cut this video into two parts. This first part is going to be a view of the outside of the camera, the interfaces on the outside of the camera and the physicalities of the camera. I'm then going to cut the second part into the inner workings of the camera, the technicalities of the camera and the comparison with the Z6 in that area, and therefore the likely benefits and impacts on the outputs from the camera in terms of still images and video. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and I hope you'll come back for the second part. Let me know what you think about the physical dimensions, how the physical interfaces on the Z50 will work for you. Are you in that position where you're looking to move from DSLR to mirrorless and you're perhaps looking at whether you buy a Z50 or a Z6? Let us know in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hit subscribe and hit notification bell below and you'll be notified of the second part of this video.